Good morning, everyone. The nights are getting longer, the days are getting darker, and there are probably only two things left to lighten up this season, the Christmas time and today's edition of the UBC Talks webinar. Hi, I'm Maria Andreeva, your host for today from the Union of the Baltic Cities Sustainable Cities Commission, and today we will talk about climate budgeting. How can cities turn all of the good climate intentions into the real world change? With all of the climate challenges, from reducing greenhouse gas emissions to adapting to climate impacts, cities need to embed climate thinking into everyday decisions. Climate budgeting can be a tool for that because it allows to align municipal finances with climate goals and transform sometimes abstract commitments into way more concrete and measurable outcomes. And today, during the webinar, we will learn how municipalities can leverage tools and peer learning to model emissions, to prioritize cost-effective climate investments, and to track the progress over time. This webinar that you're joining is organized within the UBC Talks regular series, which is organized by the Union of the Baltic Cities, a city network established over 35 years ago and uniting cities around the Baltic Sea and also associated cities from Ukraine. And our Sustainable Cities Commission is one of the 8 thematic commissions of the Union, and I'm sure you can guess that we work with all things environment and climate related. Climate lies in the strategic core of our activities for these decades until 2030. And so we are very happy to bring forward the knowledge from the Climate Forecast project today, which all of this knowledge was developed together with cities and for cities. We will have a very ambitious agenda for today with leading experts, with active cities ready to share their experiences. At the end of the webinar, we will have a slot for the questions from the audience. This is where you come in with your questions and your comments. But please don't hesitate to write your questions directly as we go. We might be able to take some questions also between the presentations, and you should be able to send your questions via the Q&A button. If it doesn't work, just let us know in the chat. It should. This webinar is recorded. It will be available for further discovery next week, together with the rest of the UBC Talks editions on our website, ubcsustainable.net. Today from the UBC Sustainable Cities team, the hosts are me and my colleague Olena Zinchuk. You will hear from her a bit later today. Now I'm very excited to give the floor for the welcome also from the Climate Forecast Project's lead partner, Donald Alimi from Hafen City University Hamburg, will introduce how the project's approach to climate budgeting came to life and some context to the practical work. Go ahead, Donald.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here and feel such a strong interest in this webinar session. And also from my side, welcome to our webinar on the climate budget concept and tools, part of the UBC Talks series and the training course offered by the Climate Forecast Project, as Maria mentioned already before. So my name is Donald Alimi. I'm a researcher at the Hafen City University in Hamburg, and I'm also at the same time the project coordinator of Climate Forecast, where Hafen City University Hamburg is the lead partner. So we from the project are really excited about today's session, which is designed to take us behind the scenes of how cities approach climate action and climate budgeting, and to share some of the work we are doing through our project. So I'm very happy to welcome you also on behalf of all our Climate Forecast project partners in this webinar room. We're really looking forward to exchanging ideas and experiences with all of you throughout this session today. But before we jump into the most exciting part of the agenda today, let me very briefly share some slides about the project behind today's session, so the Climate Forecast Project, and give you hopefully a bit of context for what you will see and hear later as well. So some of the participants today may be already up to date, but we try, of course, here to onboard also the other participants who might be new to this round. So I'll start right away. So what is Climate Forecast Project about? Climate Forecast is a 3-year project co-funded by the Interreg Baltic Sea Region Program. Its core product is an open source climate action decision support tool, or the CATS tool in short, which helps local authorities to link climate targets and actions into one place. We are a consortium of 10 project partners across the Baltic Sea region, 6 cities, Tampere, Aarhus, Riga, Östersund, Bytom, and Norderstedt, plus our tech partner Kausal from Finland, the Union of the Baltic Cities with their Sustainable Cities Commission, and 2 universities, Uppsala University and the Hafen City University in Hamburg. And we are also supported by 14 associated cities or local authorities that are following and supporting our activities in the project. And many of them are here with us at this webinar today, which we are, of course, very happy about. Good. So the challenge we are addressing in the project is broadly the struggle of the local authorities face in turning climate actions and commitments, turning climate commitments into action to reach climate neutrality. Municipalities often encounter budget constraints, limited capacity, silo decision making, among others, and climate budgeting provides arguably a structured way to address these challenges and to make emission reductions measurable and manageable at the same time. Nevertheless, municipalities, they still struggle to implement this governance concept. So to address this, a climate forecast project develops the CATS tool, an open source platform to support both climate budgeting implementation and municipal emission monitoring into one framework. And without spoiling our tool session following later today, I'll briefly say now that the CATS tool works by translating or visualizing emission data from climate actions and related impacts such as the cost efficiency into clear or easy to understand formats for decision makers. So this allows for comparing different action scenarios and aligning public spending with the city climate targets. And so far, we have been applying the tool to real-world measures in our 6 cities, where early results show how the tool helps integrate emission data into administrative and governance processes of cities to prioritize cost-effective measures and to engage as well the stakeholders in the local context. So offering through this experience is a replicable model for other cities. So about this replicability aspect, our final tool, together with the tool operationalization guidelines, will be published later in April 2026, so that any other city organizations can explore it, of course. Good, and I've arrived to my last slide. So where do we stand right now? So the project started in 2023 and runs until October 2026. And we have recently finalized the tool piloting in the 6 cities and are preparing to share results more widely with a larger group of stakeholders, for example, through this online training course today for public sector professionals, which, as you will hear also more later today, it continues also in 2026 through other online modules, and we will also conclude the course later in autumn 2026 with the Climate Budget Summit. That was it. Thank you again for joining us and for your attention. I'm really looking forward to a lively and inspiring session today. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Donald. Yes, indeed. We do a lot in the Climate Forecast project, and a lot is focused on a very practical tool that we offer for cities for uptake, but also what is climate budgeting that we keep saying, and even more wider, how do we approach urban climate governance? This is not a question, this is an invitation, because we will hear about this from Jörg Nieling from Hafen City University, Hamburg. So please, Jörg, give us a framework for this climate budgeting discussion so that cities would understand better the connections to it.
Thanks very much, Maria. Okay, so good morning, everybody from my side. I'm a colleague of Donald, also from Hafen City University, and part of the Climate Forecast project. And I would like to set a sort of framework for the topic, so of climate budgeting, looking what it means from the point of view of urban climate governance. So that means if we look at cities, we all everywhere have a regime of different tools, instruments, goals regarding climate policy. And this all together we frame as urban climate governance. And we would like to sort of describe how the climate budgeting process and tool fits into this framework. So looking a bit more on the global and local challenges on the urban climate budget governance framework, and then on tools, approaches, and at the end looking into climate budgeting as a governance innovation. The framework, I think everybody has in mind that climate change is a huge challenge, and just currently the COP in Belem again showed how important and on the other side difficult it is to implement the necessary measures. Cities can have an important important players in this framework. On one hand, they are emission hotspots, so that they are really producing a lot of CO2. And on the other side, many cities, especially on the coastlines, are on the front line of climate change. So they are really targeted by climate change, by sea level rise and other things happening. And on the other hand, there is a big need for action also in cities. So on one hand, to lead the way, those cities, as they are main actors, they need to show where the direction could go, the political direction, and they need to protect their own communities. So this all is the background for urban climate governance. So further activities, how to tackle climate change on the local level. So the main message is cities are really important for climate mitigation actions. And I think the COP in Belem also showed that it's not only the national level and the transnational level, it's also the cities that need to go forward. So if you look at urban climate governance, it refers to the ways in which public, private, and civil society actors and institutions articulate goals, climate goals, and on the other side, exercise influence and authority and manage urban climate planning and implementation processes. So to give you an idea, it means that it's the whole framework of, on one hand, the goals we have in cities and how to implement them. And important is that it's not only public, it's public, private, and civil society that need to act together as partners in this urban climate governance. Why does it matter, urban climate governance? On one hand, we have this multi-actor situation, so that the government and stakeholders have to work together. So that's also the business sector, that's science, that's initiatives, even like Fridays for Future, for example, that need to be connected for joint activity. Then it's a multi-instrumental approach. We will come back to this later, but there are so different approaches. So there is law on the one hand, so very formal instruments. There are informal instruments. There are economic and organizational instruments that need to be seen together and have to be arranged together. And there is this multi-level situation, which is very challenging. That means that local or local regional has to be connected to national frameworks. So like legislation, for example. The governance framework, in a way, is an ideal setting that provides long-term orientation. That's the goals we all, everywhere have, 2030, 2040 for climate neutrality, and an overarching umbrella for future development of the cities. So an overarching umbrella meaning also how to implement it. If we look at the multi-level and multi-sector situation, you very quickly might have in mind the different sort of levels where activity needs to take part. So there's on one hand the national level in all countries. We have to keep in mind there are specific regulations. Also in the Baltic Sea regions, they are different looking at the different countries. There are different funding opportunities, and the national level also supports cities. The local and regional level is more for the implementation of climate activities, climate actions. It manages local mitigation and adaptation. But there's also, and not to underestimate, the transnational level, like we have it here with UBC, a front runner of climate mitigation, I would like to underline in the Baltic Sea region. And there are also the worldwide ones like C40 or ICLAY that really put effort into climate mitigation and are for cities important partners for exchange, knowledge sharing, and also to set up joint initiatives like the Climate Forecast Project, for example, in the Baltic Sea region. So there is quite a framework that sort of has impact or influences the urban, the local climate governance. It can be used positively. It can be restricting sometimes depending on how it's sort of acting. Very important is the collaborative governance approach. So that means that also in all fields of climate mitigation, we have seen in the last year, it's not only a national task, it's not only an international task, it's not only a politics task. It's on one hand the political and administrative stakeholders, certainly, but it's always necessary to work together with the other stakeholders in the city. That means, as I mentioned, business, science, and civil society. So there are important aspects how to manage these collaborative governance processes that are dynamic and cyclical. They are not linear. That's important. So climate mitigation, also we have a 2030 or 2040 goal, is not a linear process because it always changes again with changing framework conditions, changing stakeholders. That can also be important. So depending on who is in charge, for example, if political change happens, so that we have to keep this in mind. So it's a dynamic process. If we look at the tools, and that is where we come closer to climate budgeting now, there are different sorts of tools in climate mitigation. There are the more voluntary, informal, or soft tools that are, for example, emission goals, or there are the climate action plans. They are often not non-binding. There are partnerships and networks, as I mentioned, the international networks that are soft tools. They can be used for climate mitigation in the cities, bringing in partners, bringing in good practices, and having the knowledge sharing opportunity. There's participatory budgeting, for example, city participation, stakeholder dialogues that are soft tools, and knowledge sharing, experimentation. Especially experimentation has come up in the last years by living labs and pilot projects as soft tools that try to put more emphasis on climate mitigation, but are not non-binding. And so there are on the other side the regulatory, hard or formal tools like law, regulations, national codes, or also local codes that are set. Is mandatory reporting can be a regulatory tool. Zoning and land using plans are regulatory. They are fixed and can be adapted to mitigation goals. But there are also financial instruments like green bonds, subsidies that can have an impact on climate mitigation. And all this has to be integrated, the targets, into legal and financial frameworks of the city. So especially the financial framework is something we are very eager to look at from the climate budgeting point of view. But cities face a lot of implementation gaps. I do not want to go into them in detail, but there are implementation gaps, there are capacity and resources challenges, and there are data and transparency challenges regarding climate mitigation. So implementation is clear. There is a lot of discussion why the goals are not implemented as they are set up. Capacity and resources face many cities like having personnel or having also budgets for climate mitigation. And data is always an issue, how to get the suitable data. So the climate budgeting approach, a governance innovation, what is it? It's the approach to break down the long-term goals into climate targets. So that means that we have the long-term goals like 2030, 2040, climate neutrality, to break them down into climate targets, also at a shorter term. To integrate then these climate targets into the budgeting process. So the city has a budgeting process each year and also a bit looking forward for some years, so that the approach is to integrate these climate targets into the budgeting process. And then to manage and allocate funds for emission reduction against the background of having the knowledge of the financial budgeting and the climate targets or the climate budgeting in a way. So this allows to assign responsibilities and also to evaluate the process so that we can make a loop back and see how it has worked and how we can sort of get better approaches. Climate budgeting, the main aspect, as I would like to mention it in this short presentation, is to bring together the political side, climate goals, climate targets, with the financial planning and implementation of the city. Two sides that are quite often not that well connected, and this is, in a way, the innovation of the climate budgeting tool. So we directly approach with this tool the different challenges and needs, the implementation gap, the budget misalignment, so meaning that budgets quite often are not really positive for climate mitigation. That means projects that are financed, infrastructure projects, for example, have a huge CO2 impact. Can they be reduced? Can the impact be reduced? Can the infrastructure projects maybe be changed, or can the solution be different? It also works on breaking up the silos in the governance of cities. So to integrate and collaborate cross-departmental is also necessary for climate budgeting. And it puts transparency on the whole process by giving monitoring and reporting possibilities because of the data background. So overall, climate budgeting provides an innovation, but as we see it, it also can have an important contribution for the city climate policy. It addresses uncertainties in emissions, impacts, costs, and timing. It strengthens the municipal capacity to take bold data-driven decisions for climate action, which is very important. And it provides a scalable framework that other cities can adopt for climate neutrality. And that's where we are today. So feel invited again, all participants, to join the climate forecast community to develop this together for your community. And hopefully we have today a fruitful discussion with you to find out what questions you have, what challenges you have in your communities, and maybe which possibilities you see to use the climate forecast tool. Thanks very much from our side.
Thank you very much, Jörg. This was a very clear, very understandable structure, and I think very good framework for understanding of what we talk about when we say climate budgeting, because in practice, as we see, thanks to the discussions that climate forecast space creates, climate budgeting can be so many things. The approaches can differ quite a lot, but it's important to have some kind of common ground, like of the shared understanding. Thank you so much for the presentation. I would like also to encourage all participants to not hesitate and ask questions to our speakers via the Q&A box. I don't think there are any questions yet, but we will have a slot at the end of this webinar to take them up. And now let's go further into exploring some local practices and local approaches. We have a pleasure today of hosting two cities, Espoo and Aarhus, who are both aiming to be climate neutral by 2030 very soon. So let's see how the process is getting there. I welcome Mia Johansson from the city of Espoo to share the insights about climate budgeting there.
Hi, and thank you. Good morning from Espoo. My name is Mia Johansson, and I work as a climate specialist in the city of Espoo in Finland. So where is Espoo? And this is Espoo. Espoo is the second largest city in Finland. So we are part of the Helsinki metropolitan area, and we are situated right next to Helsinki, our capital. And by Finnish standards, we are a large city. We just crossed the line of 300,000 inhabitants a couple of years back, and we are still growing fast. At the same time, nature is always nearby in Espoo. So we have 58 kilometers of seashore, 95 lakes, and about 165 islands, which is more than in Hawaii. Of the land area in Espoo, forests occupy nearly 60%. So there's a lot of forests as well. But at the same time, even when we have a lot of nature nearby, and that is what our residents also appreciate a lot, we are also a center for business and research and education and innovation. About 50% of the value of Helsinki Stock Exchange comes from the businesses located in Espoo. So there's a lot going on in the second largest city of Finland. We can go forward from here. Thanks. So we are also targeting climate neutrality by 2030, and that means an 80% emission reduction from the 1990 level by the year 2030, and the remaining 20% can be absorbed in carbon sinks or compensated by other means. This target that we have is directed by our climate neutrality roadmap that outlines the measures for reaching the climate neutrality by 2030. And this is how it's going so far. So the blue line going up is our population, and the black line going down is our total emissions. So you can see that the sort of peak in our emissions was around 2007, and it's been going down fast after that. At the same time, our population has almost doubled. So our population will be doubling by the year 2030. And at the same time, if you look at the emissions until 2024, we have been able to reduce those about 33% since the 1990 levels. And also, if you look at the strong growth of the city at the same time, the emissions per capita have been decreasing by 64%. So we have been able to cut down emissions quite fast. But now going on to the next slide, you will see the future forecast of the emissions trend until 2030. So this is how it's gonna be looking like in the next 5 years. We just updated the projected emission trend until 2030 this year, and now with the updated revision, we are looking at less reductions in our emissions than we were expecting a couple of years back. So instead of -80%, we will be reaching about -60% by the year 2030. So it's not going as well as we were hoping, which means that we will be revising our climate neutrality roadmap this coming spring, and preparing some new climate measures so that we can achieve our climate target. I also want to show this in addition to our regional emissions that I showed before. So in addition to the regional emissions, we are also measuring and calculating our consumption-based emissions of the city. This basically shows the emissions of the citizens, for example. So emissions that are like, or the emissions that are basically consumed in Espoo area but are not created in Espoo area. So the regional emissions refer to emissions that are sort of created in the city region. But this is some information that we are gathering, and our goal is also to reduce the consumption-based emissions of the area. But then moving on to the climate budget topic of today, we have implemented a climate budget in Espoo, and it aims to make our climate action increasingly accessible to our decision makers, to our partners, and to our residents. So how does it work in Espoo? What I've learned so far in this climate budget course is that there are a lot of like different ways to approach the climate budgeting topic. So this is how it works for us. This was actually the climate budgeting was an initiative from the city council in 2023. So this is how we got here. So this is why we implemented it in the first place. It's thanks to our active council members. But so since 2023, the climate budget in the city budget has integrated climate work into the financial planning of the city. So the climate budget helps us to incorporate the climate targets into the city's ordinary budgeting processes. So the city allocates resources to climate action as part of the city's normal spending decision making and financial expenditure framework. So the climate budget does not represent like an additional or separate budget for climate work. And why do we do this? As I mentioned, the climate neutrality target we have, it's one of the key objectives of the city strategy. And this way we can follow the progress money-wise and budget-wise. The climate budget is part of the implementation of our climate neutrality roadmap, and this is sort of how we bring out the information and make it more visible budget-wise. And how it's done in two parts of the year. So first we have a climate budget, which is published annually as a part of the city's budget. And then the second part comes later during the year when we monitor that through the city's financial statements. So in addition to presenting the operating expenditure and investments allocated to climate action, the budget also presents emission reduction scenarios and written statements about climate action. So again, bringing more information, and this is one of the ways to bring the information to our decision makers. And then the climate neutrality roadmap then presents the city's pathway to climate neutrality in more detail. And this project was originally implemented as a project. We got a funding for that. And the whole project and the process has been done together with the city's financial planning services, which was really important for our experience. So we were able to actually integrate this into the financial planning and budgeting of the city, and not as a separate thing. And here's an example of the 2025 figures. First, you can see on the green box, you can see that 14% of the city's operating expenditure was allocated to climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. That was basically often energy efficiency, renewable fuel for cars, for example, and those kinds of things. And next on the box, you can see that 60% of the city's investments were again like allocated to climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. The majority are investments on public transport connections. So we are heavily investing on a metro lines and train lines or train tracks and the city development. So that plays a big part of our investments. But at the same time, you can see that even though these are identified as climate work, these are also investments that are making the city better in other ways as well. And for the subsidiaries part, those investments, 10% of the investments by our subsidiaries, those are basically additions to the metro capacity that we have on, up and running, and circular construction, for example, and those kinds of examples. So you can see like different topics arising from the overview of the climate investments and operating expenditure that we gather from the data that we get each year during the budget process. And then for the future development, so we are also taking part to this climate budget course, and we are also learning about the different examples here and hoping and getting inspired by others. So as even though we are happy about the progress that we have done, we are also considering ways to improve this climate budgeting that we do and making it more efficient. So this slide comes with a lot of question marks because we are still thinking about different ways to improve the data that we get and improve the process itself and the ways that we use the data. So first of all, there's one mention of the collection of data for a smooth process. So at this point, this means that we are collecting information on shared Excel sheets, within the city organization. So some manual work is needed each round to make it work. So we would like to make that process smoother. But then there are a lot of questions about how to use the data and how to make it more efficient. One of them is my thought that what would it cost if we didn't do climate action? So, and also coming to the other investments that I showed you before, there are many more benefits than just the climate benefits. So with the investments, for example, that we do, we could measure health benefits, city savings, and other benefits. So as you saw, a big percentage of our investments is directed to climate measures, and I would hope to show also the other benefits behind that. And then on the other side, I'm still wondering with my colleagues how we could make the climate budget more effective for financial planning and decision making. One option or one idea would be to include the climate action to the city's budget framework and budget negotiations. So at the moment we are just looking at how the progress is going and reporting on how it was implemented, but it would be more efficient to actually get to the part where the budget is being planned and the budget framework is being done, so that we can get to that point and see where financing is needed, for example, where the budget is needed in order for us to reach our climate goal, for example. And finally, how to ensure that our city budget supports city targets for climate neutrality. So these are these are questions I still don't have any answers for. We are still thinking about these same like issues or challenges that we would hope to bring to our climate budgeting, and hoping to make it better and make it more transparent and understandable, and basically our like hope is that we can improve the climate budgeting to better serve our decision makers. But at this point, with these thoughts and with the inspiration I'm hoping to also get from this course and this whole process, I want to thank you from our side, and feel free to ask any questions or give any comments or your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mia, for the presentation, but also for joining our climate forecast movement and the course, so that we can like truly have a good platform for exchange of different approaches among such ambitious climate smart cities. It's a very impressive progress in the emission reduction that you showed, and it's really wonderful to see a great commitment of the city, which is also visible in the allocated costs. Thank you so much for this example. We have some questions that we'll have to take at the end of this webinar during the questions from the audience part. And now let's move to our another example, Danish example from Aarhus, which is also partner city of climate forecast. So you will hear a more climate forecast oriented approach example. And I welcome Amalie Ellegard Möller and Mats Beck Pedersen to present this approach. Welcome.
Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about climate budgeting in Aarhus municipality. And first, we will introduce the climate action plan. Next, we will present how we present and use emission scenarios. And lastly, how the CATS tool, so this tool developed through the climate forecast project, enhances data-informed decision-making. So first of all, a little bit about Aarhus. Our population is approximately 375 people, and it's the second largest city in Denmark. It's a university city, which implies that we have a very young population. But Aarhus also includes a large area outside of the urban area, which are smaller villages, and also a lot of agriculture and forestry, which can be seen on the map, where all of like the yellow areas are the more rural areas of Aarhus municipality. So the climate action plan in Aarhus has the ambition, Aarhus has set an ambition to be net climate neutral in 2030. This is our new climate action plan from 24-25, and it shows the possible path of becoming net zero in 2030. This climate action plan focuses mainly on scopes 1 and 2, and as Aarhus as a territory, but also Aarhus municipality as a company. So right now, at the moment, the political focus is mostly on these actual projects that can become real reduction projects. Yeah, so just to give you an example, or just to show you how the CO2 emissions are divided between sectors in Aarhus, the total emissions are approximately 1.2 million in 2023, and 61% of these come from stationary energy, which is like the largest emission sector in Aarhus. 31% come from transportation, and we have a small amount of emissions from agriculture and land use, and from waste and IPPU.
Thank you. So I'll talk a little bit about how we use emission scenarios, so like the calculating part of the climate budgeting, towards the political decision makers and as well towards the administrative decision makers. So in our climate action plan, similar to many of your cities, we have a 2030 goal. Some might have a 2035 goal or 2025, but we have to look forward into the future and calculate what is a realistic and achievable reduction of certain initiatives. To do this, what we rely on in Aarhus is a very detailed business as usual model that forecasts all our activities, emission factors at a very detailed level all the way towards 2035. And this model enables us to actually, with a high certainty, say, if we have a project regarding more electrical buses, we can see our expected path if we do nothing, which really is what enables us to do these emission scenarios quite detailed. So our best advice for any cities just starting with climate budgeting and thinking about how to do these CO2 numbers would be to pour a lot of energy into a detailed business as usual model, because that would save you a lot of hours later on. When we then have these results, we like to present them within the different sectors of the emission scenarios in the GHG protocol. So this table here is in Danish, but what it shows is 4 different projects you can do regarding agriculture, some regarding removing agriculture, some regarding animal husbandry, some regarding forestry. And what we present to the administrative and political level is, first of all, the CO2 reduction in 2030, which is their goal. So that's the yearly scope 1 and 2 reduction you can see first. For some initiatives and projects, we also estimate a scope 3 reduction, which is similar to what Espo and Mia talked about with the consumption-based goals. We're not that far regarding consumption-based goals, so what our main focus is these yearly scope 1 and 2 reductions. And then in the spirit of climate budgeting, we also present the cost effectiveness for every one of these initiatives. And the way we calculate the cost effectiveness is how much the municipality as Aarhus has to pay for each reduced tons of CO2. And we do this as a cumulative, like the sum of all the costs for the next 5 to 10 years and the sum of all the reductions. And we do this because some projects might require a high upfront investment, and then the reductions might come later on. We also highly emphasize that this cost effectiveness is not end all do all. It's only the municipal cost and it's only CO2 we capture in this. So we do not capture the better air quality from forestry and so on. So we have to still show in verbal and in argumentation that there are a lot of co-benefits and co-disadvantages of different actions. And what we have done with this is that we have, with the political level, agreed upon a set of actions towards 2030 that actually shows an achievable way to get our goal of becoming net neutral in 2030. And we actually have a quite big negative uptake in 2030 if we achieve all of these actions. And we emphasize that it's a good idea to have this sort of overachieving goal, since some actions might not deliver 100%, but might only deliver 80% of what we believe. So having this buffer is very good for achieving our climate goal. I'll talk a little bit about the climate action decision support tool, which Michael would introduce later, but we have already started using it at Aarhus. And I'll show you a few screenshots about how we use it to do these CO2 numbers, cost effectiveness with the decision-making level. So the first thing I'd like to show you is how we can show the CO2 numbers from every sector. So these numbers you'll see here was the same that Amalie presented some time ago. But what we have the ability to do is focus in on different aspects. So let's say the transportation emissions. Then we can focus further in on what sort of transportation emissions are we talking about. And we can focus on road or waterborne transportation and so on. And we can even go even further into, let's say, what kind of on-road transportation is these? And even further into, okay, in the passenger cars, is it petrol, is it diesel, what are we talking about? And this level of detail allows us to calculate these CO2 effects much more precisely when we're talking to people, because then we can speak in a common language about what are you trying to achieve with your project, what part of our inventory is this affecting at a very detailed level. We already have quite a lot of actions from our work with the Climate Action Plan and previous climate work. And we have uploaded all of these projects and actions into the tool. So we will soon have 32 different actions, which you can sort of decide if you want them or you do not want them. We upload all the 32 actions as these have been implemented. But if we have certain political parties who do not want to do a certain initiatives, this tool provides them with the ability to see how does that change the climate action goal if I do not want a payment for fossil cars entering the city, or if I do not want to spend that much money on forestry and so on. So this is a way of providing equal access to our knowledge for all who are interested. And what we see the main purposes of this tool that we will hear about is mostly regarding transparency. The knowledge that is kept as civil servants is usually quite high in most cities. But what we see as the main challenge is making it easy to understand and reaching the people who are making the decisions, so usually politicians. And for that, it has to be very equal and easy to understand. And that is what this tool does very, very good, with good visualizations, click actions on and off, and so on. Furthermore, it also provides equal access. So it's not like that the political parties in power have better access to this knowledge than the political parties in the opposition. And we believe that's a very good use of this tool. Currently, we mostly use it at the administrative level to explain to executive level what happens if we do not use this action, what happens if we eliminate this action regarding our CO2 numbers and different actions that it impacts. But we hope to also use it in political negotiations regarding revisions of the Climate Action Plan. And that is all from Aarhus Municipality. Thank you very much for listening to our short introduction to our climate budgeting work.
Thank you very much, Aarhus Municipality. It was a super interesting dive into the climate budgeting approaches, and it's also great to confirm some things like it's important to land the idea with the decision makers first. It definitely seems like it makes it a smoother process. It's great to use climate budgeting as a tool to have a dialogue between the city administration levels. It's also thank you for the best practices in agreeing on common vocabulary. It's also very practical things on how to make this happen. Yeah, thank you so much. We're getting more questions, which we have to leave for another 15, 16 minutes, because first we need to hear about the tool, which you guys from Aarhus already shared some glimpses of. And now I give the floor to Michael Mehenich from Causal Company, who are actually developing this tool so we can dive into more how it works and functions. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just share. All right. So hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Mechnik. I'm a sustainability data scientist with Causal, and we at Causal are the technical partner on the climate forecast project. So our responsibility is the development of this climate action decision support tool in collaboration with our partner cities. So I'll be giving just kind of a brief introduction to the tool this morning from more of a technical perspective. What it can do and why we developed things the way that we did. So as Donald mentioned at the very beginning, this tool is an open source tool and will be freely available along with the guidelines for operationalizing the tool in your city governance context once those are finalized next spring. So to kind of give just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about this morning, I'll dive into the CADS tool and give just a brief introduction to it, and kind of the three phases of the tool or uses of the tool. So as a decision support tool, a communication tool, and a calculation tool. Then I will give a live demonstration of the tool, focusing on Aarhus for continuity, but also relying on some of our other pilot cities. And then finally, I will just briefly return to the presentation to talk about sort of the data that's required to actually take the tool into use. It's a very data-driven tool, so the data that you bring to the tool is important. And as we have heard this morning, it can be one of the challenges of climate budgeting is this data aspect. So talk a bit about what's required to use the tool. But before we dive in, just maybe to kind of summarize the CADS tool in a few key numbers to kind of show how it's being used currently. So right now we have tools online for 7 cities in 6 different countries, and we're covering a total kind of core urban population of over 2 million residents. We have 123 actions, climate actions included across those 7 tools or city tools, and those result in a total emissions reduction of almost 9 million tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalent from the baseline to the target year of each of the cities. So it's also being used to manage total costs of these climate actions of over 5 billion euros and benefits savings of almost 200 million euros in 3 different currencies. And actually, these numbers are still growing all the time. We're still adding more. So actually, things have increased slightly since I made this slide about a month ago. So to answer this question, what is the CADS tool? So it has kind of 3 different faces to it, and I think first and foremost, it's intended to be a decision support tool for the climate budgeting process. So it does that by bringing all the relevant information together in one place and sort of presenting the economic impact of climate actions, say, alongside the mitigation impact. So here we're seeing one shot from the tool where we're looking at the action list for one of the cities. And we can see both the emissions reduction, the net cost of the action, and then the cost efficiency, that is the price that we pay per ton of CO2e reduced. And when we can see this all together, we can compare, prioritize, make the case for certain actions over others, with the general idea of bringing climate actions and climate considerations more generally into the city budgeting process. It's also a communications tool, and I think Aarhus really emphasized this part well. So the tool can be used to visualize outcomes of interest, whether those are emissions, energy, financial balances for a given scenario. The tool also includes some sort of custom-built financial visualizations so that we have cost efficiency or MAC curve there. We have cost-benefit visualization and return on investment. And when the tool is hosted online, then it's available as a public website that's interactive and lets everyone see everything that's there that goes into the calculations, and is hopefully understandable for everyone. Certainly possible to include a lot of descriptions, explanations, user guide, all this kind of thing. And then what is it? Sort of the third part of it, behind the scenes, it's a calculation tool. So I know that some of these calculations can be done, say, in other tools, but what's kind of different about the CADS tool is that it's a structured calculation model that actually incorporates causality right into the model, right into the structure of the calculations. And so what this allows us to do is do some fairly complex scenario building. It allows us to model interventions at multiple steps in emissions generating processes. So for example, if you have kilometers driven by different vehicles, that becomes fuel consumed by those vehicles, and the fuel consumed becomes emissions. We can have actions that intervene at different stages there. We can change the vehicle mix, we can change the fuel efficiency, we can change the emission factors of the fuel. So having that kind of causal depth to the model allows us to model different actions, basically. And the tool also then handles interactions between climate actions, so synergies and dampening effects that might be that might result from actions targeting different processes or different activities within the city. So now I think I will switch over to my demonstration here. So I thought we would just take a look at some of the tools live, just to get a sense of what these what it is that we're talking about here. And I thought I would mostly spend focus on the Aarhus tool, but we'll go to several of our other pilot cities as well here. So as we mentioned, when the tool is hosted online, it's available as a public website. So when you arrive at the website for the tool, what you see when you arrive is sort of the primary outcome of interest. In this case, it's net emissions. So as Mads already talked about in his presentation, what we can do here is kind of drill down. So we start with a broad overview, and then if you want more details, so what we're seeing here is sort of a time series of emissions for each year, colored by the different emission sectors. So if we hover, we can see our stats for each sector. And we've got these cards below the main graph, and these allow us to drill down into increasing levels of detail. So here we can look at just transportation emissions. From there, we can say just on-road transportation emissions. From there, we've broken it down by vehicle type. So we'll try passenger cars. And at the very bottom here, we see it broken down by fuel type or energy carrier. While we're on this main page, I'll just mention that basically everything is controlled by this sort of scenario builder up here. So we can change the year range that we're looking at. We can choose between different predefined scenarios. So currently Aarhus has their baseline and then their action plan. And that will affect all the graphs here and all the calculations. And what we see here also are so emissions shown under these different scenarios, or for the scenario that we've selected here. The dashed line here is showing us the baseline, so we can compare how much we've reduced versus the baseline. And then this red line is a total line, which is useful for those places where we actually have some negative emissions and need to find the net. So to highlight that this is actually kind of a built on this structured calculation model that includes causality, we can actually go to a detailed view of each of these. So if we look at passenger car emissions, we can do read more, and we can load the details page for this particular graph or link in the causal chain. And here we can actually see then that we have these different attributes. So when you do your inventory or you do your forecasting, you have different categories that are important to you for different different sectors, and we can basically transfer those to the tool as well. So right now we're visualizing by energy carrier. We can also visualize by vehicle type. In this case, it's all passenger cars and greenhouse gas. So it's possible to kind of see each of the different breakdowns that we have, and also do some filtering. And if we come down to the bottom of the page, then we can see the causal chain. So we can see the links in the causal chain that directly affect the graph that we're looking at. And we can see those links that this graph has an effect on. So here I'll just highlight that if we go up the causal chain, what we're looking at here is on-road transport vehicle mileage. So this is just to highlight that when you follow the causal chain back to the beginning, you can include these activity data as well. Another thing to note is if we, for example, go to another Pilot Cities tool, it's possible to have different outcomes of interest, which are available across the top here. So that you can have, say, just corporate or organizational emissions, territorial or citywide emissions. Any outcome of interest can have its own tab across the top here. And one tab that all the tools have is the Actions tab. So this brings us to the list of actions that are modeled in the tool. So here we see the list of actions, their mitigation impact, their cost, and their cost efficiency. Here it's possible to say, for example, add descriptions and link to the detailed calculations. And also on this actions page, we have those graphs that are custom built for the climate budgeting context. So, for example, I'll go to Östersund, another city in the project, and here we're seeing their cost efficiency or cost effectiveness graph. So this is familiar as a MAC curve for those who know these. So here we're visualizing the cost efficiency of the different climate actions. So the more negative the cost efficiency, actually the better, because that means that we're saving. So in this particular action, we have a cost effectiveness of minus 22 or minus 23,000 Swedish crowns, which means that we're actually saving that amount per ton of CO2 reduced. And the width of the graph, or the width of each bar here, indicates the total cumulative emissions reduction. So the more negative and the wider the bars, the better the action. And finally, we can take a look at the cost benefit visualization as well. So this is more of a financial visualization, but here for each action, we can see the total cost of that action, the total benefit. So this might be savings in operations, savings in energy costs. For this particular model, they also have the cost of carbon included. So as you reduce emissions, you actually generate a monetary benefit as well. So here we can see the total cost, the total benefit, and then the net. And so it's easy to see which of the actions sort of perform best in this financial kind of respect. So with that, I'll just briefly go back to my presentation. So what's needed to actually take the tool into use, the types of data that are useful to gather as you're thinking about potentially using a tool like this. So the tool is quite flexible in the data that it receives, but ideally you would have some sort of the emissions generating activities within your city. So electricity usage, vehicle mileage, tons of waste landfilled, these sort of things. And then emission factors, which take those activities and convert them to greenhouse gases. So kilowatt or sort of kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour, or kilograms CO2 per vehicle mile, these sort of things. Because the tool is built for this climate budgeting purpose, it's useful to have unit prices there so that you can actually put a cost on your energy usage. And then as actions reduce energy usage, you'll see that financial benefit. And finally, in order to incorporate the actions into the tool, we need like estimates of the impact of those actions on different activities. Whichever activity or sector the action targets, we need just an estimate of how much this action will reduce electricity usage or reduce this emission factor, this kind of thing. So with that, I think I will wrap it up. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very interesting introduction, and thank you so much for the very helpful visualization of how the tool works in practice. So all of you who are joining today, do you know if your city is doing climate budgeting? What is our level of understanding here? Are you new to this topic or not? It would be very interesting for us to see. Definite yes about climate budgeting from 34%, definite no from 45%, and a bit more uncertainty on 21% of participants if this process is actually happening in the city. This is all very good for us to know, because it's as we keep going with this topic, it seems that, of course, many cities approach it very differently. So sometimes it might be something similar to climate budgeting. It's just not called like that. And then I wanted to go into the question. Yeah, there was a question to Orhus, to Espo, sorry, at the beginning. And actually, Mia already answered it in the chat, but I wanted to ask still to comment on this. So there was a question about data, and I think it's rather exciting question because it's so huge. And Mia, you commented that you had some data to begin with when you started the climate budgeting, but it wasn't in the consolidated form. And I just wanted to ask if you could maybe comment on the on how you actually developed the understanding what data is needed to like how did you identify eventually? Did you identify eventually what work counts as climate work? Like, was there any clarity to this process that you could share maybe as a best practice?
Definitely, yeah. And thank you again for the question. That was a really relevant question on Q&A about the data that we had to begin with, and if we needed to collect some more data or refine it further, and how long did it take until we had like a perfected data situation, and what were the main challenges for that. So yes, as mentioned, we did have some existing financial data in this, like inside the city sectors or units, but the quality of the data depended on the city unit and different sectors. So it was like some of it was on really rough level, and some of it was quite refined already, and so on. But we needed to have a lot of like one-on-one discussions with both the managers and in the expert level during the process of like getting to the climate budgeting, and also we organized some trainings for the personnel. So with that, we got to the refinement part of figuring out, because the main issue was to understand what would be counted as climate work and climate mitigation and adaptation, for example. So So we got there, and and now like with this training that we did, it did take like almost a year to prepare for this first round of climate budget. But nowadays we have done it a couple rounds now. So nowadays we only do these like walk-in clinics couple times per year, every time the process like gets going again. So with that, we want to ensure that the city experts, if they are unsure, for example, what data to put in or how to categorize their data, for example, so we are able to then help them make the decision. And we also get the data because we use like these shared Excel sheets. So we also get the data from them, and then we can like correct some minor mistakes if there are any. So it still goes like through. It's like a verification process, so to say.
Thank you so much for the explanation. And it's also like how to break the silos between the departments. There are some more questions and more questions. First question, I think for both cities, how do you get data from private sector and citizens? It's also something, as mentioned in Espoo, you have the consumption-based emissions. How do you get the data? Maybe you could also, Mia, take this first.
Yeah, I can start with that. But we gather data from different sources. So basically, for the territorial emissions or regional emissions, as we call them here, different data is used for that. So we get like an annual inventory from like a municipal, not municipal actor, but Helsinki Environmental Services, which offers like all the municipalities in this area the data of our total emissions in the cities. So that's the data that we get yearly. But to get to the projected scenarios that we saw briefly, how do we get to the target in 2030? We used like a ton of different like data sets of different like expectations of how different markets, for example, the electrification of car fleet, for example, is going to develop, and the sources of electricity, for example, and heating and things like that. So there's a wide set of data for that. I can get to you about that in a more detailed level if you like. But and then coming to the consumption-based emissions, there's a different data set for that. It's a bit more difficult to get that data. There's been a national project that we have taken part into, and it's often data that also works as in a national level, but they have tried to like implement that in a municipality level as well. So it's a bit more rough. We don't get like the exact emissions from those sectors. They are often like dealing with consumption of food, for example, or different consumption categories and so forth. So it's a bit more difficult to get exact data of how the citizens in Espoo, for example, consume. But yeah, those are different data sets that we use ongoingly for the climate work, and how to sort of like how to sort of see behind the trends and how we'll be going forward from here.
Thank you so much, Mia, for the insights. And sometimes maybe it's good even to have rough data to start the work and refine it later. The same question to the Aarhus team. How do you get the data from private sector and citizens? And maybe you could also at the same time reflect on the usefulness of this concept in your discussions with the decision makers.
Thank you. So I'll agree with Mia in that we have data from many different sources, but I don't think we get any data from private sector and citizens. What we do in Denmark is that most cities and municipalities have gone together in a national project to create an identical inventory. So we do the same methodology, and we collect data together across 90% of Danish municipalities. So that's our main way of doing it in scope 1 and 2. And regarding consumption-based emissions, we're still working a bit on that because, as Mia and others have said, it's a work in progress. Data is very rough. There are some worldwide databases and so on. But what my suggestion would be, if you do not have an inventory, is that most cities have a rough idea about where the biggest emissions are. Stationary energy and transportation for most cities, and start focusing on those and get reliable data that you can collect each year at an easy level, so you don't have to ask people to deliver data as much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then there's a set of questions to Michael about the tool. So let's go into them. First of all, could any city start working with the tool? Would you recommend the tool also as an instrument for small cities or municipalities? What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, so once the tool code package is finalized next spring, it will be available to all cities all over the world. And I think it could be used in any size city, big or small. It's just a question, I think, of the data collection. So it may be that bigger cities have more resources and more ability to collect more data that's fed into the tool then. And to the extent that the tool is quite data driven, that can be important, but really any city can use it at even sort of a more basic level to visualize, say, your inventories or do some basic forecasting.
Okay, thank you. So the answer is yes, any city all over the world. And then there is another question which is more technical. Michael, can you see this question also about the approach that the tool uses to identify which facts actually cause sustainability impacts in cities? Could you
It's
maybe
true.
reflect on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So of course there are different kinds of interventions, and some are much more difficult to quantify than others. So what the tool can do is kind of carry forward very sort of well-established quantitative relationships. So we know that if you reduce fuel consumption by this amount, you'll reduce emissions by this amount. Or if you reduce kilometers driven, that sort of propagates down to less fuel, less emissions, and so on. Where the tool relies on its users is to quantify those interventions that are maybe a little bit fuzzier, like say behavioral sort of interventions. So if you have some program to increase public transit usage, how effective that is, and actually having the modal shift from cars to buses and trams and so on. There we're really relying on the city to have sort of done the study and to have some estimates for that they can put into the tool. It itself doesn't get into that. It just sort of carries forward in the causal chain as sort of the mathematical, more deterministic kind of impacts. If hopefully that helps answer that tool or that question.
Thank you very much, Michael. There is one more question that I maybe would ask very quick reflections from Orhus and the ESPO, because we will further explore this actually in the training course. Does connecting the financial aspects improve willingness of decision makers to talk about climate mitigation? So does climate budgeting help with convincing decision makers? Yes or no? In your cases.
We can go first this time. So definitely yes. Especially the cost effectiveness is something that our decision makers respond to very positively. Just having, with all the uncertainties, just having this rough number or precise number, what is the price per ton CO2 reduced? That's the most important number.
Thank you so much. And Mia?
I agree that costs are obviously, and money talks. So costs are obviously like important for our decision makers, and the transparency of what's needed, and the whole like I don't know, the the whole knowledge that we try to put out there. It's definitely something that our decision makers are appreciating. But coming to the like budget wise, we, for example, now that we are preparing more climate measures to achieve our climate neutrality target, we are planning on including the impact on emissions from those measures, but also how much they would cost the city, or how much they might bring savings, for example, or even profit from parking fees, for example. So those are like different aspects that we want to include in the decision making, to make them like to help the process for our decision makers.
Thank you so much for the reflections, Mia. And yes, this webinar is not the end, it's only the beginning. And where does it lead us? Please, Olena Zienchuk, my colleague from the UBC Sustainable Cities Commission, tell us about the training course that we have had.
Good morning from my side as well. I hope you can see my slide, and I will try to storm through them in 2 remaining minutes that we have left until the end of the webinar. Now that all of you hopefully got a taste of what climate budgeting is, some of you maybe twice already in Malmö, and now during the UBC talks, we will once again invite you for the more comprehensive climate training course that will about to start in January. So overall, inside our climate forecast project, we have planned to have a training course that will happen during the last year of the project. And we, as I mentioned, have already begun promoting the concept, promoting the examples from both the cities that we have in the project, but also cities outside and forerunning cities from C40 network, for example, who are doing climate budgeting, in order to not only promote, like also promote that type of thinking that Jörg was presenting, and exploring variety of tools for cooperation, but also slowly and gradually equip participants with knowledge needed to be actually able to use the CADS tool as well. So maybe just to repeat what Michael has said, is that our tool will be available for everyone to download together with the guidelines how to set it up in spring. So if you follow nicely our training course, you should be about ready in April, May to start digging into it and working with it in your municipality. We are planning for 3 or 4 more online modules, which would be which would go way deeper than today's webinar. They will be longer, about 2 to 3 hours, and we will try to cover various aspects of climate budgeting based on generally what the process would require in the city, but then gradually also linking it closer to the tool, what would be needed to work with the tool, how you can interpret different kind of results you get with the tool, and in that way also linking it to the outcomes of the piloting done in the climate forecast project. So our next online training, which is module 2 now, because we consider module 1 done with all the introductory and promotional events we have had as a first climate budget summit and today's webinar. And we are planning it for the last week of January. We're still refining the agenda and confirming with the speakers, therefore we cannot really tell you the exact date, but we are in between 2 of them. Maybe something will happen, it will be yet another date, but so far we're eyeing those 27th and 29th of January. And the first actual training module, so the module number 2, but online training number 1, would focus on aspects of starting climate budgeting, if your city hasn't started it yet, about various prerequisites, including political support and mandate, or just trying to pilot the tool based on your interest and the help in the overall climate plan implementation process and so on. We will hear of some examples how the cross-departmental cooperation have been set for various cities and how it worked out. And also we're still planning to look into some climate actions that have been selected, at least on the sectoral basis. Subsequently, we are hoping to go deeper into the climate actions portfolio and related emission data, how to build your inventory, what kind of data you can get from where, different national guidelines and sources and things like that, which we a little bit touched upon the questions from audience today as well. And also how to maybe handle negative emissions and things like that. Subsequently, we will talk about the financial side of the question, how to look at the action impacts, and hopefully we're also able to discuss a little bit not only financial data, but also non-monetary benefits that could be achieved and how different cities are looking at it. At the end of we still have like a joker module in between where we are thinking to whether our very, very vast program would be able to be squeezed in these 3 online trainings. We need an additional one, but we're also thinking about some kind of a simulation case, practical case for that joker empty module at the moment, where city that could, for example, is very new to all of this and cannot obtain certain data could still have a very good grasp how the whole process could look like and work with the CADS tool as well. And we will lock this all up with the second Climate Budget Summit, which is currently preliminarily planned for October 2026. This is when our project is ending as well. We hope to have a physical event and welcome as many of you as possible to hear about the outcomes of the project, the outcomes of the training course, and all the exciting exchange we're able to organize during this period of time. We're also thinking conceptually about having more active involvement of our participating cities so that you can actually learn some practical skills by attending this course, but those are also absolutely non-mandatory. So if you're interested just in coming and listening to expert presentations, get inspired, hear about more results, you also do not necessarily have to complete more active involvement in the course as well. So we're welcome cities at any stage of climate budgeting process and at any level of interest, and hopefully as many of you as possible can join. I will finish here my presentation. Everybody who attended today's webinar will get an invitation to the first online training module where we will go deeper into all this, but of course, also please feel free to share it to your colleagues and within your networks. We will try to attract as many participants as possible so that we could have it truly many-sided and all-inclusive, so that we have many different examples, as many as possible. So thank you, and Marie.
Thank you so much, Elena. Yes, just last things before we finish for today. So you can explore other UBC Talks topics, because today we talked about climate budgeting, but what could be the climate measures to take, you can find in our webinar series, recording series on our website. The link to the climate budget training I also sent in the chat, so hopefully you could access it. And then there's only one thing that's left on the last slides, which is a big thank you. So big thank you to all of the wonderful speakers who took us today through this journey. I think it's becoming very clear that climate budgeting is not just a buzzword. It's a very concrete, very actionable path that the Baltic Sea region cities can take to align finances, governance, and climate ambitions. So if your city is not doing it yet, this is definitely the time to start. Discuss this with your colleagues, decision makers, financial staff, and explore how the climate budget can fit into your city's cycle of planning. And we are here to support you with trainings, with the knowledge exchange. So let's make this a growing movement for the municipalities in the Baltic Sea region. Thank you again, everyone joining us today for this webinar and these very exciting discussion.